Here we go. Excellent. All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity to give you my take on what's happening with Russia and Ukraine right now. Just as a point of background as to why I'm doing this, I actually started out life in the 1980s as a Soviet and East European specialist. I got a master's in Soviet studies. My PhD was in Soviet studies. Learned Russian, lived in Russia for a while, was all set to work for the agency and be a spook, and then they went out of business in the middle of my PhD. So I had to metamorphose into a more normal economist, but I have kept up on it, obviously, all these years. And the other thing that's kind of relevant is that I've been the red team economist for the military for about the last 10 years, and actually maybe longer than that. But that all got started because of that Soviet connection, because when they first started having me participate in these red team programs was when we were very active in Afghanistan. And I had obviously been studying the Soviet involvement in Afghanistan in the 80s. So I actually knew who the players were. I mean, I remember having a long conversation about where Gulbuddin Hekmatyar came from and why we cared. So it is kind of a serendipitous thing in a way that I'm an economist now, focusing on all kinds of aspects of the global economy at the same time that Russia and Ukraine have altered the global economic environment pretty dramatically, at least in the short term. Whether this becomes a long-term issue kind of remains to be seen. It sort of depends on how things play out. But that's why I'm holding forth. That's why Angelo has decided to have an interview, question and answer session with me.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. And I really appreciate you being available at such short notice. I know how busy you are these days. But I guess my first question, and probably what a lot of people are wondering, is where do you think this is going to end, or how do you think this is going to end? Is this going to be much more extended than maybe we previously thought?
There's really four answers to this, and not that they're contradictory at all, but you've got four different kind of elements in play. Number one is, does this satisfy Putin's desire to rebuild the Soviet Union? Will he go for another country? So is there going to be threats to the Central Asians, to the Caucasus, to the Baltics? Question number two is, what is the end game for Ukraine? Is it an overall occupation of Ukraine, kind of reintegrating it into Mother Russia, or is it establishing a vassal state similar to what they now have in Belarus, where they're nominally independent, but they do what they're told by the Kremlin? The third issue is what this means to other countries. And frankly, from the military perspective, that's the number one issue, is will China take this as inspiration to do what they want to do? The Chinese have obviously come in and supported Russia, or are planning to support Russia, buying their oil and gas, buying their wheat, whatever it happens. But does this then become a signal to the Chinese that they could go after Taiwan, they could go after the South China Sea? And then the fourth issue is, what of a long-lasting nature are we seeing in the international economy? You know, is there going to be very high oil prices for a very long period of time? Is it going to disrupt the agricultural market? Is it going to have profound implications on central bank policy and all the rest? And all four of those questions are sort of up in the air. You know, we're just going to have to watch closely from day to day. I think at the moment there's a sense that Russia may have miscalculated, Putin may have miscalculated the world response. And I think there was an assumption on his part that we wouldn't do very much, because frankly, we couldn't, in terms of stopping an invasion or doing anything to rescue Ukraine. But one of the most significant developments and unexpected developments was literally today. The Germans have now committed 100 billion euros to their military, the biggest military budget they have had since World War II.
Wow.
They have agreed to become a 2% of their GDP contributor to NATO, which they have been resisting for 40 years. And they have declared that, yep, we're going to contribute at 2% of our GDP or possibly more. And when you recognize that this is coming from a left-wing German government, would not maybe have been too surprising if this had come from the Christian Democrats, but this is the Social Democrats. This is Olaf Scholz in coalition with the Greens. So the left of the German political system is supporting a military buildup unlike Germany has seen in 7 decades. So it basically is a very definitive statement to the Russians. We Germans think of you as enemies, period. And that could have long lasting implications. Not that it's going to mean a war between the two, but given the support that Russia has gotten from Germany over the years in investment and all the rest of it, that's just about dead. The Germans are taking a side. France already has. I mean, French military buildup has been significant over the last several years. So there have been signals that this was very definitely a step too far. You know, we can't stop you from crushing Ukraine, but whatever future hopes you had for the Russian economy, they're gone now, buddy.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that Putin also miscalculated the resolve of the Ukrainian people? Because it's just amazing how they've fought back and at least have been able to hold them off up to this point.
Well, to a degree, but understand that the Russians have thus far only committed about 40% of the troops that they had on the border. And they've done what is normally done in an invasion like this. The first line of troops that have been sent in are their least experienced, least professional soldiers. These are the conscripts that the Russian army is full of. Their elite troops are the ones that will come in next. And anybody familiar with military strategy knows that, as grim as this sounds, you send in your cannon fodder first. And so the Russians are counting on the fact that Ukraine only has so much weaponry. I mean, they're using everything they have in the opening days of the invasion, and then there's no more.
Mm-hmm.
So they will not, right now, they're successful at attacking tanks and that sort of thing because they've got the weapons, but they're running out of ammunition already. And it's going to be a matter of time before they collapse. And then at that point, the more professional Russian army comes in and it's basically over. What Russia wants to do is install a puppet government. You know, they will put somebody in power that is sympathetic to Russia. They have had leaders in Ukraine that have been pro-Russian in the past, and they're very likely to bring those people sort of out of retirement and say, hey, look, you know, they're Ukrainians. You once had them as president, so we're just bringing them back because your current bunch was not acceptable. So
yeah, how long do you think, as far as how could I put this? How long do you think Russia has, or they're going to be able to actually withstand a withdrawn conflict, in other words? Because I know this is a very costly undertaking for them.
Mm-hmm.
And financially, they don't seem to be the healthiest nation right now.
Right. And they would not be able to withstand this level of commitment for months and months. They probably will not have to. You know, what would happen most likely is that this puppet government gets installed. The Russians leave troops behind to back up that government and then pull the rest of them back into Russia itself. The biggest threat to them financially is that we really have had an impact on their financial system. If you look at the numbers that just came out today, you know, the ruble has fallen to levels that you haven't seen in 50 years. If you had $10,000 essentially in a bank account last night, it's now worth $5,000. Half your money just vanished because the ruble dropped. The bond market has collapsed. The central bank upped its interest rates to 20%. I mean, so they are desperately trying to keep the financial system from full-on collapse. They will probably be rescued to some extent by the Chinese. The Chinese are offering to get their banks involved. They're going to purchase whatever Russia wants to sell in the way of gas and oil. So they've got an out, and Russia has the biggest gold hoard in the world right now. They've been accumulating this for years. So they'll be able to withstand that for a while. But the average man in the street in Russia, there are already bank runs. There are already people desperately trying to get their money out of ATMs and they can't get it. And people have been wiped out financially overnight. And they're all kind of looking at each other like, why? You know, why are we suffering? What difference does it make what Ukraine does? And so there's going to be a certain amount of resistance within the population. Whether it turns into something tangible, I doubt. Putin certainly has ways to crush the opposition. He's been doing it for years, but it becomes increasingly difficult to govern his own country. And what has traditionally happened with Russia is that the periphery begins to pull away. You know, it's one thing to control St. Petersburg and Moscow and the bigger cities. You start getting out into the Siberian territory, they're almost independent already. And this just pushes them that far away from the central government. So it's interesting to watch that even within the Russian leadership, you've got people who are trying to kind of control what's happening, not with any success, but their central banker has been sounding the alarm, saying, this is not good. I'm your central banker, and our banking system is about ready to fall apart. So even the fact that they're getting allowed to say that is interesting.
Well, you know, Chris, that kind of leads me to another question. With a lot of people in Russia for the first time, I mean, you're seeing all of these different protests and people being arrested, of course, and so forth. But what kind of effect is that going to have on the future of Putin's control over that country? Are things actually going to change? Is he there for, in other words, is this the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin?
It's probably not the beginning of the end for him, because he's very, very carefully created a very strong dictatorial government. But what happens in almost every case when you've got a strong man of this caliber, what happens next? There is no next Putin. There's no one that would have anything close to his authority or popularity. And over and over and over again, we've seen historically where a very, very strong, dominant figure is incapable of anointing his successor. And you just don't have the ability to sustain. And, you know, we saw it in Venezuela. You know, Hugo Chavez had total control. The people that replaced him, complete sycophantic nothings, which is what you have in Russia. And China is the epitome of a autocracy that knows how to play the game, that as people are getting ready to cycle off, they anoint the next generation. So there was no revolution when you went from Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao to Xi Jinping. I mean, it was just fluid. That could be a challenge for China in the future because no one's had the power that Xi has now or will have at the end of the 20th Congress. But Russia has never allowed a next layer of leadership. And, you know, Putin is still in health and all that stuff, but he's not the spring chicken he used to be. So that's something that is not imminent, but it becomes a concern. And when that point comes, the fragmentation of Russia could accelerate. So we're kind of, you know, 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, looking at some of that kind of upheaval.
Okay, so the next question I have for you actually is one that I think a lot of people are wondering is, where do you see the NATO countries as well as the US coming into this conflict? What is the next step beyond the sanctions, if there are any? Hopefully there aren't.
Yeah. Yeah, there won't be any next step. I mean, there's no military option at all. The NATO response is, as it has been, they're beefing up NATO members. So they're basically putting NATO troops in countries that are already members of NATO. So at this point, all we can really do is sit back and watch this and hope that there's some kind of a ceasefire, some kind of a more or less transition. The biggest immediate challenge for Europe is what to do with 2 million refugees that are pouring into Eastern Europe, into countries that are already restrained with immigration issues and are now just completely swamped. They're turning to the European Union. The European Union is turning to us and saying, we need money to support this. I mean, half the population of Ukraine is on the road heading to Poland. So what do we do with these people when they get here? And then it becomes a matter of what sort of message do you send to say, don't push your luck and do this again. We talked a little bit about who might be next. The Russians don't really have an incentive to go after the Central Asian states because they're either distant enough that Russia doesn't care, or they're run by a dictator that's close to Putin already, like Kazakhstan. Then you've got the Caucasus. They've been sort of keeping their heads down and staying out of all this. And then you've got the Baltics. And those are the most threatened because Russia has made noises about bringing them back for a long time. But the Baltics are already in the EU. They're already protected by NATO. So getting into them would provoke a reaction because they're already part of the alliance. Plus the fact there's not much of a Russian population there. Ukraine is half Russian. So getting into Ukraine, you already had the eastern half of the country on your side. Estonia is close to the Finns. The Latvians are close to the Germans. The Lithuanians are close to the Poles. So there's no Russian domestic population that would support Russia. Plus the fact they're a lot easier to defend than Ukraine. So there really is no place else for Russia to go. And I don't think that there's that desire to expand geographically. Economic pressure, to be sure, but I think that Ukraine plays a very special historical role in the minds of Putin and Russia. So I think this is kind of a one-off in that respect. The world's attention now is going to start focusing on what's going on with Asia. Like I said, I was talking to these military guys on Friday, and they pointed out that there have been a lot of naval ships in the Pacific, basically kind of demonstrating to China, if you are thinking about this, don't. So we have apparently repositioned missile submarines into the area. We have missile frigates in the area. And it's sort of like invading Ukraine was a land war. Invading Taiwan is going to have to be by sea and air. And anything we see threatening that island will blow out of the water or blow out of the sky.
Wow. Okay, let's bring this now back to the US and how this is going to affect us. Well, before we even get into that, let's talk about these sanctions, especially the ones that were levied over the weekend. In your opinion, what do you think as far as the actual effectiveness of all these sanctions? I mean, it's easy to see this morning that there's already been some destruction on the economic front for Russia.
Yeah, it'll hurt them in the short term. They will probably get backup from China very soon. They have the gold hoard that they can access, so it's not going to collapse their economy, though it will hurt it. The biggest implication for the U.S. is obviously energy and food. The only thing that we're really interacting with Russia over is gas, oil, and wheat. Ukraine and Russia together produce 25% of the world's wheat. So the price of wheat has already begun to skyrocket. which is kind of a mixed bag because it's bad news for the consumer because prices of food commodities go up. For the farmer, it's like, yeehaw, anybody that planted winter wheat is looking at a windfall this spring. And that's going to really bolster a lot of the wheat growing parts of the US and Canada. It will also have a lot to do with what's going on in other wheat producing countries like Brazil and Argentina and Australia and the like. So the biggest immediate impact is oil. I mean, oil going over $100 a barrel, getting up to 105, falls back a little bit, goes back up again. We are more or less at full production in the US. So, and we're the biggest oil producer in the world now. So we have some protection as far as oil production. In a year, I don't think you're going to see 150, 140, $130 a barrel oil, but a lot's going to depend on OPEC and what they decide to do in terms of production. Gas is a different issue. Europe is looking at 700% increases in gas prices. So they're buying more gas from us, which is driving up the price of natural gas here and adding to the pressure on the oil market. And that is conceivably something that begins to right itself by the middle of the year because the other producers will pick up with those opportunities. OPEC, for example, but also a lot of these kind of marginal producing countries, the Bolivias and the Guinea-Bissaus and the Angolas that basically get into the market when the prices are high enough, and they're certainly high enough. The activity in North Dakota is full blown right now. I used to check what was going on in North Dakota by calling the Motel 6 in Williston and seeing what their daily rate was. And at the height of the last oil surge, it was $490 a night for a Motel 6.
Wow.
And then it fell back to 40 where it should be. It's up in the 200s now. You know, if you want a hotel room in Williston, you're going to pay a couple $100 for a Motel 6.
Wow. Well, I guess that's a good indicator.
Yeah, it certainly tells you what the activity is. And so I think the consensus view is that the Fed is not yet worried enough about this to stop raising rates. They still plan to raise rates in March. They're not worried about another economic decline, kind of because there's a balance. It's one of those things where on the bad side, you've got the situation with Russia and Ukraine, but on the good side, you seem to be leaving the pandemic behind. Right. That by the middle of March, the mask mandate is lifted for like 75% of the country. And all of a sudden, everybody is like, okay, I'm done with this. I'm going back to my normal life and it's over. And even Fauci has talked about the pandemic becoming an endemic, that it's going to be something we deal with every winter, like flu season, it'll be COVID season, but it's not going to be an issue through the summer. So that's been good economic news pushed up against the bad economic news coming from Russia and Ukraine.
So as far as their interest rates, what you see in terms of the increases coming from the Fed, you don't think this is going to have any effect on what they originally planned to do?
Not really. And even among economists, you're getting a real even split. There was a survey done just over the weekend, and about 40% thought that the Fed might start to push rates a little bit faster, a little bit higher, maybe getting up as much as 2.5% by the end of the year, 6 potential increases. But the other 40% said, no, it's not going to do that. You know, the Fed is not going to get excited and decide that inflation is out of control, because they're still reacting to the fact that most of the inflationary pressure is coming off of energy. Right. 70% of what's been driving inflation has been oil and gas prices. And the expectation is that even though you're pushing Russia, which is a big oil producer, out of the market, you've got the potential for others to come in behind it. One of the most interesting side conversations is at the very same time that all of this is happening with Russia, Iran has been making noises about getting back into these nuclear talks and has finally identified the two things that they want to happen before they get into these talks. And if they get into the talks, then they start coming back into the world as a producer. And even with all the sanctions, they're still the fourth largest oil producer in the world. And the two things they want is a guarantee that anything that they sign this time won't be undone by another president. So they're sort of like, we signed a deal under Obama, Trump took it back. We don't want that to happen again. If we sign another agreement, it's got to be in stone. Nobody can change. And then the second thing, and that's probably doable, but the second one is the tough one. The second one is you have to quit interfering with us supporting terrorists. And it's like, but we don't want you to support terrorists. Yes, I know that, but we want to. And we are not going to withdraw support for Hamas and Hezbollah and Al Qaeda and IS, if for no other reason that if we stop supporting them, they're going to attack us. So it's kind of like, this is like a protection racket. If we keep supporting them, they don't go after us.
I don't know, Chris. That second condition sounds like it's going to be a deal breaker for the United States.
I don't think that's gonna be. But if the Iranians are sitting there going, okay, we didn't have very many cards before, but now we have oil and gas. It's like, how badly do you want this? And then we probably wouldn't knuckle under, but the Europeans would sit there saying, we really, really need this. The only thing that is kind of benefiting that negotiation is simply the time of year. The Europeans are looking at this going, if this had blown up in October, we would have been in a much worse position because we're going into winter. This is March. We're not going to be as dependent on gas, period, as we get into warmer weather. And we won't be dealing with people freezing to death in their apartments because they can't afford their gas bill. Right. So it's kind of like this could come up again next fall, but at the moment it's like, come on, spring. Spring and summer, we can relax about this a little.
Yeah. So getting back to the Federal Reserve, and then we're going to go on to inflation. But so they have their first increase is projected to take place in March.
Right.
Is that going to be 25 or 50 basis points in your?
Very likely a quarter point. You have seen some conversation. Jim Bullard from the St. Louis Fed, who's newly on the Open Market Committee, threw out the possibility of a half-point increase, but he didn't get a lot of support from the other members of the Open Market Committee. So the consensus view at this point is that the Fed is going to do what it usually does. It will do slow change and then watch to see what happens. So it'll punch that quarter point increase, kind of hint around that, hey, we'll meet again in less than a month. And if we need to do it again, we will. And if we need to do a half point, we will. But we're going to see what happens first. And part of the challenge for the Fed is that all they can really do is control money supply, and that takes months anyway. Right. And the biggest driver of inflation are those commodity prices and wages, neither one of which are really money supply oriented. So the Fed is kind of like, well, we could get more aggressive, but that's not really the issue. We kind of want to see what's happening with oil first. And if it looks like the oil sector is not going to correct itself, then we'll have to think about it. But for the moment, it's kind of throwing the ball back into the oil producer court, saying, okay, every other time prices have gotten this high, everybody and their brother starts producing oil. So wouldn't that be a good time for you guys to start doing this? And you're hearing that noise from, like I said, all the traditional big players, but also these more marginal producers that are saying, hey, when it hits $100 a barrel, even we can make money off oil.
Okay, so how many rate increases do you anticipate? Because it's been all over the board,
Oh
but
yeah.
I've heard some predictions as high as 9 to 11. Somebody said it's
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah. I think that's really excessive. The Fed at the moment saying 3, pushing things up to 0.75 if they do it a quarter point at a time. The most common alternative to that has been not more increases, but higher increases, that they would do half point rather than a quarter point. So the range that I've heard that seems pretty reasonable is anywhere between a low of 0.75 to a high of 2.5. So it would either be maybe 3 or 4 half point increases, or maybe as many as 6 quarter point increases. So I think the critical thing is not how many times they raise it, but it's what they raise it by. So low end 0.75, high end 2.5.
Okay. In your opinion, what kind of effect is this going to have on our economy overall when they get done with these increases? Do you think first of all, do you think that they're truly behind the curve as people are saying?
I don't really think so, because in the curve at this stage, I mean, you kind of have to go all the way back to 2008 to determine whether the loose monetary policy was a good idea or not. And frankly, I'm in the headquarters of the loose monetary policy is a bad idea camp. Back when they were determining what rates should be in the 2008 recession, there was an 11-1 vote about lowering rates and pursuing this very loose quantitative easing. The one was Tom Honig, the Kansas City Fed chair. And he has retired, and his successor is Esther George, who is very much a disciple of Tom Honig. So the Kansas City Fed has said all along, there is too much money in the economy and rates are too low. They've been kind of voices in the wilderness for the better part of 10 years. So there is an argument to be made that there's too much money in circulation. It's almost too late to bring it under control. What a interest rate would do to the economy, I don't think a lot short term, because the rates would still be historically low. As recently as 2007, they were 4 or 5%. So it's not like we're in territory we've never been in before. And it has a little bit of a silver lining, because when I talk to bankers, they're saying, look, we do know that rates slow things down, but it also gives us more margin to work with. We will be a little less risk averse, because up till now, we've only been able to loan to people who are absolutely guarantees, because we've got no float. If we get a little bit of float, we can start being a little more risk tolerant and be a little more interested, particularly with commercial loans. So I think a modest rate increase is probably not going to hurt us. The challenge would be if we decided that inflation was really beginning to tip and accelerate at a consistent rate and was being pushed by something other than oil, then the Fed might be tempted to get up into 3, 3.5, 4. Then it begins to have an impact. But even the other central banks in the world are not changing the tune. I mean, European Central Bank, Bank of England, and they have also watched those countries that did jack up their rates see abrupt slowing in their economy. Brazil pushed its rates up very high and immediately saw an economic decline. So the other central banks are like, okay, let's not do that. So let's be restrained here.
Yeah.
And that's still kind of the watchword.
Well, and again, that leads me to another question, because you're giving us some really good information. A couple of things. First of all, let's talk about mortgage rates, because the housing market has been incredibly strong now for quite a few years. And you're looking at some of these increases, which, look, it's only my opinion, but I don't think they're sustainable, especially as interest rates keep moving up.
Right.
Where do you see interest rates moving by, let's say, year end in terms of maybe the 15-year and 30-year mortgages? Do you have any predictions on that?
The predictions that are coming from most of the analysts are running mortgage rates for a 30-year, somewhere in the high threes, low fours. So up from what they are now, but not dramatically. The challenge with housing has been, as it always is, it's so location driven. You've got astronomically high prices for homes in some areas, and you've got falling prices in others. And you try to get this Case-Shiller average around the country. And in the last Case-Shiller index, you had as many cities that were seeing a bit of a decline in home prices as you saw those getting higher home prices.
Mhm.
So it's become very regionally driven. I just got a note from a friend down in the Fort Myers area of Florida, and the appreciation in home prices there is absurd. I mean, they've doubled in
I
the
know.
last 10 years. But then I got a note the other day from a friend who's outside Detroit going, yeah, well, not here. You can practically buy the whole city for $1.50. So it's entirely driven by the regional popularity. And I think to a large degree, the reaction to COVID drove some of that housing demand because people were looking to leave congested areas and move further out, and people could work from home and all the rest of that stuff. So I don't think we're looking at a nationwide housing bubble, but I think it's very likely that you're looking for mini bubbles in places like Austin and maybe Phoenix and Florida and Nashville, places that have just absolutely been on fire. And even some of the newer hot places to live. I mean, home prices in Boise and Spokane have been skyrocketing. So it's just because those became the place to be, and everybody is like, how exactly did that happen? But we can thank Zoom for that. You can live in
Mhm.
Spokane and work for somebody in Seattle. So
Yeah. Let me ask you then, in terms of inflation, because I know last time that we held a webinar, you talked about inflation moderating,
yep.
especially toward the end of the year. Do you still see that?
Yeah, I think so. It's going to be dependent on energy. And the big driver, I think, towards the end of the year will be wages. I think the energy prices will probably have started to calm down. Not that they're going to go back to what they were, but not keep escalating the way they have. But wages will be the big concern. Will the wage price spiral start? There's evidence of some of it already, and it's the concern that you can't really stop. Wages go up and the producers raise their prices because of that, which causes the wages to go up again, because if you have leverage as an employee, you want more money to handle. Because right now, the inflation rate has been higher than the increase in wages. So you've seen about a 5% across the board increase in wages versus a 7.5% increase with inflation. So you've got more people pushing for higher wages. If that leverage is somehow interrupted, and one of the things we kind of forget is that we didn't have inflation for 40 years, because if people demanded higher wages, we shipped those jobs overseas and we got lower production costs. If we're not doing as much of that, then we end up having to eat those higher production costs. Unless, and this is probably more medium to long term, I look at manufacturers who are facing higher labor costs and they're saying, well, welcome to the world of robotics. I don't want to pay these people this much money anymore. I'm going to put in a lot more robots, a lot more automation, because they don't ask for a raise.
Well, we're seeing that in our industry as well, of course, and I
Yep.
think in manufacturing as a whole, and that's going to be a huge shift
Oh,
in the
definitely. I
coming
mean,
years. It already is here.
yeah, it eliminates that traditional starter position. It becomes a matter of, if you have the skills, you can go right into manufacturing and make a tremendous living. But if you don't, well, those starter jobs are now being done by machines,
Absolutely.
and the service sector has even become more robotic. I mean, it's getting into more. I mean, I talked to a McDonald's franchise owner, had 26 restaurants. They're all completely automated. There are 2 employees, one guy running the tech, one guy cleaning the tables. The food, everything else was made by machine.
That's really incredible if you think about it. My goodness, think about all the jobs that's going to affect.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, it's just it eliminates, it creates a real pressure that if you don't have the training, education, skills, you're really stuck. It's very difficult to learn those on the job because companies can't invest the time to take somebody with no training and get them up to speed. I mean, your industry is like manufacturing in general. The vast majority of its members are relatively small. They have 20, 25, 30 employees. You know, they don't have the capacity to hire somebody who's not going to be productive for a year or two.
Yeah. Yeah. So moving forward, what about as far as with the interest rates and so forth? How do you see GDP turning out this year for the US?
I think it's going to come down a little bit from what we hoped it would be. We were originally looking at around 3.5, maybe even 4% for the year. That has now been reduced to maybe 2.5 to 3. So it's still within the bounds of what we normally grow. Our 20-year average is 2.5. So it's not by any stretch a recession. It isn't even a downturn, but we've gotten used to very strong growth. 2021 featured 6.5% growth in the second quarter. So we're not going to see that anymore. So it's going to feel slower. But in general, the economy is kind of going back to norm. And, you know, barring anything just truly bizarre, I mean, there are all kinds of scenarios where something completely unforeseen, a revolution in Saudi Arabia, the Ukrainians blow up the Russian oil fields. I mean, who knows? But if barring something like that, we're basically in pretty good shape.
Going back to what you were talking about in terms of COVID, and that's one thing with everything happening in Ukraine, you haven't really heard that in the headlines nearly as much as
yeah, thank God.
Yeah, for sure. But now that we're entering into what they're referring to as the endemic phase, do you see where there's going to be a point where people will start returning back to the offices? Maybe not like before, but obviously this remote
there'll
working
be some. The prediction is that maybe we get, right now we're about 60% remote, and some of the more optimistic predictions are saying maybe we get to 30% remote, 30 to 40%. So you're still talking a third, depending on the business. I mean, obviously many people in your industry, that never was an option. You know, you can't bring the equipment home and work it out of your garage. But accountants and lawyers and, you know, people that essentially do their work individually and alone anyway, have gotten used to a remote environment and will probably stay there. And that's probably the last thing I can answer today. I've got to run off and hit another meeting.
No wonder.
But we
no
have
problem.
remind everybody that we're doing an actual, real, honest to God AWFS webinar at the end of this month.
Absolutely.
Or next month.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate you taking the time and on such short notice with your schedule, especially.
Yeah.
And we'll
Thanks,
be talking
guys.
to you soon.
All right. Thank you, Angelo. We'll talk soon.
All right. Bye-bye.